And from this date onwards, really, there is a great change in the attitude of the British to the Indian people.
This feeling coincided with new inventions and initiatives that would bring the two worlds of England and India closer together, with horrific results for both. In the days before the Suez Canal, the passage from England to India was round the southern tip of Africa, a journey of some 14,000 miles that could take up to 6 months by sailing ship. But in 1837, the first year of Victoria's reign, the East India Company employed a retired naval officer to find a faster route. Thomas Waghorn was typical of the Victorians who would expand the British Empire. Part adventurer, part visionary, part man of business. He proposed a shortcut to India, across Egypt and down the Red Sea. Most people thought he was mad. The overland journey across Egypt was plagued by bandits, and the Red Sea was prone to sudden storms. That made it hazardous for large sailing ships. But Britain had pioneered the age of steam, and Waghorn gambled that steamships could operate on the Red Sea without fear of wind or current. As a coaling station, he used the port of Aden, the first colony acquired in Victoria's reign. Soon, regular services were plying the Red Sea between Aden and Suez. More traditional methods were employed to smooth the journey across Egypt: camels, carriages, and hefty bribes to buy off the bandits. Before long, Waghorn was running a thriving business. But his shortcut to the Orient would stir up unexpected trouble in India. The long sea voyage around the Cape had deterred many English women from joining their menfolk in the Far East. But Waghorn's shortcut made the passage to India much easier for them. In addition to the wives came thousands of young women who hoped to attract one of the company's eligible bachelors. These women were to have a dramatic effect on the way of life enjoyed by the men who ran India.
With the coming of the women, there was increasing tendency to establish separate enclaves for Europeans, known as cantonments, which were usually on the outskirts of cities. And in these places, the Europeans were able to live in their own houses. They would socialize together. They wouldn't even go into the town to do their shopping. They had their own cantonment shops, so that they never had to go to the native bazaar. So they were completely enclosed. And in this situation, the European women had really very little contact with the outside world. Their main contact with the Indians was with servants, and these were people whom they commanded as inferiors. They learnt some basic Hindi words, which were often the most insulting forms of address to people. But they did this because this was the way you addressed your servants.
For another thing, of course, there was the sexual aspect of it. They didn't want their menfolk to be associated with Indian women, understandably so, really. But that meant that the gulf was driven through the relationship between Britons and Indians.
The amusingly playful Bibi was pushed into the shadows, slowly, but not entirely, receding. Now, instead of spending his off-duty hours in the Bibi Gar or with his men in the native quarters, the company officer was expected to retire to his bungalow and the bosom of his English family. It was a bosom that often quivered with righteous indignation at what was glimpsed of the world beyond the European compound. The daughter of an English merchant in Lucknow complained bitterly.
The streets are never known to be swept, and flies abound in such numbers that sometimes the shops can only be opened at night. Besides which, the place is infested with monkeys that unscrupulously walk off with all they can lay their hands upon.
Such women were scandalized by tales of the pleasures sampled by the native rulers in the privacy of their royal palaces, and by those more widely available in the natch houses of the native quarters. It was not only English women who demanded change. The same steamships from England brought out missionaries who were determined to make India not only more civilized, but more Christian.
The missionaries who came were very intolerant of Indian religions, particularly Hinduism, which they saw as a religion of superstition, of dirt and squalor, but also of idol worship.
We must unite to condemn the barbarous and obscene rites of Hindu superstition.
The chairman of the East India Company, himself a fervent evangelist, suggested that the company might do more in India than just make money.
We might diffuse among their inhabitants, long sunk in darkness, vice, misery, the light and benign influence of the truth.
There were obviously some practices carried on in India which were, by any standards, reprehensible.
The most disturbing of these practices was the Hindu tradition of sati, burning a widow alive on her dead husband's funeral pyre, ritually prepared by the priest with water, milk, and honey. When a delegation of Indian notables protested that sati was a time-honored custom of their people, General Sir Charles Napier spoke for many of his countrymen.
My people too have a custom. When men burn women alive, we hang them.
We can justify the British attempts to root out these practices, but I don't think we can justify the way that they were made into symbols of Indian degeneracy.
There were too many young men in a hurry in India. They come out to Britain, from Britain, with the best of intentions, believing that they had come to India, were about to remake the country, had come as civilizers. And at the same time, many of them were quite fervent evangelical Christians. They were contemptuous of Indian beliefs, openly ridiculed Indian religions and customs, and behaved in a way which suggested to a lot of Indians that the momentum of change was quickening and that it was unstoppable.
Some Indians decided to make a stand. They would fight and die to defend their religions and culture. One of them was a young Muslim called Azamullah Khan. He would prove to be one of Britain's most deadly enemies. Azimullah's dealings with the British began as a child when he was brought by his mother to a Christian mission in the north of India. Famine was stalking the region, and mother and child were starving. The mission took them in. Azimullah was educated in the mission school where he learned to speak English and French. But he had been born a Muslim, and he resisted all attempts to convert him to Christianity. When he left the mission, he took a job as khitmutgar, or butler, in the home of an English family. He joined a great army of servants who catered to the needs of the British in India. From the relays of punkawallas who fanned the air in the stifling bungalows, to the trusted ayahs who looked after the children, and to the lofty khitmutgars who served at table. Many remained faithful to their British families through a lifetime of service. But others nursed a bitter, even murderous resentment against the sahibs and mem-sahibs whose whims they had to satisfy. Such a man was Azimullah Khan. In the 1850s, Azimullah joined the followers of an Indian nobleman with his own grievances against the British. Nana Sahib was the leader of a once mighty Hindu nation, the Marathas, who had been defeated by the armies of the East India Company. Nana's father had been paid an annual pension by the company to keep his family in princely style and to maintain a small army. But when his father died, the pension died with him. His enraged heir, Nana Sahib, decided to appeal to the directors of the East India Company in London, and the man he chose to represent him was Azimullah Khan. In 1853, Azimullah traveled to Britain, expecting to see the great source of power that had so impressed Muslim writers before him.
It cannot be without the will of that one supreme being that this small island, which seems on the globe like a mole on the body of man, should command the greater part of the world and keep the rest in awe.
But Azimullah was astonished by the smoke and squalor of London. Here was none of the wealth and dignity maintained by the British in India. Instead, he saw the drunks and the whores, the beggars and the street urchins. Whole families trudging to factories and workshops. In the engine room of empire, the smoke and the dirt blinded Azimullah to the power and the wealth. When the East India Company rejected his appeal on behalf of Nana Sahib, Azimullah was indignant.
England will yet regret the manner in which it has used my master.
It seemed an empty threat, but fate would provide him with the opportunity and the weapon. As Azimullah began his return journey, the British rushed headlong into the first major war of Victoria's reign. It was provoked by fears for the security of the overland link to India pioneered by Thomas Waghorn. In the spring of 1854, Russian armies were sweeping through the Balkans and the British public clamored for action.
First of all, people thought, well, the overland route must be protected. The whole of the Middle East was suddenly seen as a defensive barrier. If somehow someone got across the Middle East, they could invade India. Well, after all, all these statesmen and generals are all learnt in their public schools about Alexander the Great. He'd done it, so why couldn't someone else? What if the Russians try and follow Alexander the Great? The Tsar had 1 million men. The figure was always said, 1 million men, and he could somehow march them to India. What would the Indian people do? Would they support the British, or would they support the invader?
But the government was divided. The Prime Minister wrote to the Queen,
"No doubt it may be very agreeable to humiliate the Emperor of Russia, but it is paying a little too dear for the pleasure to cover Europe with confusion, misery, and blood."
It was a view shared by Victoria's German-born husband, Prince Albert. His opposition to war became widely known, and the public turned on him in fury.